He was never supposed to be emperor. He died the most powerful man in Japan. This is the story of Go-Shirakawa Ho-Oh, the retired emperor who outlasted everyone. He outlasted Taira Kiyomori, who imprisoned him and thought that would be the end of it. He outlasted Minamoto no Yoshinaka, who occupied Kyoto and thought he could use him. He outlasted Minamoto no Yoshitsune, who fought brilliantly and died alone in the north. He outlasted the Taira clan itself, watching it destroyed at Dan-no-ura from the safety of the capital. He outlasted almost everyone who had tried to control him, use him, or simply survive him. He was 66 years old when he died, in 1192, having been at the centre of Japanese politics for nearly 40 years. Nobody saw any of this coming when he was born. Go-Shirakawa was born in 1127, the fourth son of the Emperor Toba. The fourth son. In the politics of imperial succession, being the fourth son was not in itself a disqualifying position. Japanese history had seen younger sons reach the throne when circumstances required it. But the fourth son was not the expected heir. The expected path of succession ran through the older brothers, through the established calculations of the court families who managed these things, through the specific alliances and arrangements that had been constructed around the assumption that the succession would proceed in a certain order. Go-Shirakawa was not part of those calculations. This position, outside the main line of succession, outside the expectations and the preparations and the specific training that the expected heirs received, shaped Go-Shirakawa's early life in ways that would, eventually, prove to be formative in directions that no one at the time could have predicted. The expected heir received the preparation of an expected heir, the specific cultivation, the introduction to the people and the processes that would eventually be under his authority, the gradual assumption of the responsibilities that came with the position he was being prepared for. Go-Shirakawa did not receive this preparation because he was not expected to need it. He was free, in a specific sense, the freedom of the person who is not being watched, who is not being prepared, who is not being groomed for a position that requires constant attention and management. What Go-Shirakawa did with this freedom was pursue the things that genuinely interested him, things that the preparation for imperial responsibility would not have had much time for. He loved music. Specifically, he loved imayo, the popular songs of the 12th century, the music that was not the refined court music of the official ceremonies, but the earthier, more immediate music of the streets and the entertainers. The music that the court aristocracy sometimes condescended to, but that Go-Shirakawa found, apparently, more genuinely engaging than anything the court's official aesthetic framework had to offer. He pursued this music with the intensity that distinguished Go-Shirakawa's engagement with everything he cared about, practicing until his voice gave out, seeking out the best performers of the tradition, spending time with people whose social position was far below his own, because they had what he wanted to learn. This intensity, this willingness to pursue what genuinely interested him without excessive concern for the proprieties that his position might otherwise have required, is one of the characteristics that appears consistently in the accounts of Go-Shirakawa throughout his life. From the young prince who practiced imayo obsessively, to the retired emperor who maneuvered between Kiyomori and Yoritomo for decades. He was not a person who did things halfway. He was not a person who maintained careful, detached distance from the things that engaged him. When Go-Shirakawa was interested in something, he was fully interested in it. And this quality of full engagement, whatever its specific object, was as visible in his political maneuvering as it was in his music. The death of his older brothers and the specific political circumstances of the late 1150s eventually brought the succession to Go-Shirakawa in a way that no one had planned for, and that Go-Shirakawa himself had not, apparently, anticipated. He became emperor in 1155 at the age of 28, already an adult with formed habits and genuine passions, and a perspective on the world that had been shaped by years of existing outside the main line of expectation rather than inside it. He was not the emperor that the court's careful planning had produced. He was the emperor that circumstances had produced, when the careful planning had been disrupted by the specific contingencies that disrupted it. And the emperor that circumstances had produced turned out to be something that the careful planning had not anticipated and could not have produced. He was the most politically durable figure of his era, not because he was the most powerful, not at the beginning, because he was the most difficult to finish off. He was never supposed to be emperor, but once he was, nobody could figure out how to make him stop. The year 1156 was the year that everything changed. Not just for Go-Shirakawa, but for Japan. Go-Shirakawa had been emperor for only a year when the crisis arrived. The crisis that would define the political landscape for the next 3 decades, and that would, in retrospect, represent the moment when the heian world's long decline into genuine instability finally became undeniable. The crisis was the Hogeno run, the Hogan disturbance, and its causes were the causes that political crises in dynastic systems typically have: a disputed succession, competing claims on power, and the accumulated resentments of people who believed that the existing arrangements had not given them what they deserved. The specific dispute involved Go-Shirakawa and his retired father, Toba, and the question of which political faction would control the succession. Toba had retired, but had not ceased to exercise political influence. The specific pattern of the retired emperor institution in Japan, where retirement from the formal position of emperor did not mean retirement from politics. The faction that supported Toba included Go-Shirakawa's older brother, Sutoku, the former emperor who had been forced to abdicate years earlier, and who had nursed the specific resentment of a man who had been displaced from a position he believed was rightfully his. Go-Shirakawa's faction was, in the most direct sense, the faction of the current emperor, the faction with access to the formal authority that resided in the reigning emperor's position. What made the Hogeno run significant beyond the immediate political question of which faction would prevail was what it demonstrated about the actual basis of power in 12th century Japan. The dispute was resolved not by the court's traditional mechanisms of negotiation and precedent and the careful management of aristocratic consensus, but by military force. Warriors fought. One side won. The losing side faced exile, execution, or both. Sutoku was exiled to Sanuki, where he would die years later, his bitterness having transformed him, in the legend that grew around his story, into one of the most powerful, vengeful spirits in Japanese history. Go-Shirakawa won. The specific warriors who fought for Go-Shirakawa's side in the Hogen-no-ran included Taira no Kiyomori, who was at this point a capable warrior of good standing, rather than the dominant political figure he would become, and Minamoto no Yoshitomo, the head of the Minamoto clan. This detail is worth holding because it represents the specific moment when Go-Shirakawa's relationship with the warrior world began, the moment when his political survival first depended on the military capability of specific warriors who chose to fight for his side. Go-Shirakawa did not forget this. He was a man who paid attention to the things that mattered, and what mattered, after the Hogen-no-ran, was that his political position had been determined by the choices of warriors. The lesson that the Hogen-no-ran taught, a lesson that Go-Shirakawa would spend the next 3 decades applying, was that political survival in the new landscape of 12th century Japan required a sophisticated understanding of the warrior world and of the specific individuals within it, whose capabilities and whose loyalties would determine which political arrangements could be maintained and which could not. Go-Shirakawa developed this understanding. He developed it by paying attention, by cultivating relationships with warriors in ways that the court aristocracy, which tended to view warriors as instruments to be used rather than people to be understood, generally did not. He developed it by watching how the warrior world worked, how loyalty was earned and lost, how the specific calculations of individual warriors about which faction to support were made, what they responded to and what they did not respond to. 3 years after the Hogen no Ran, the second crisis arrived. The Heiji no Run, the Heiji disturbance of 1159, was, in some ways, the Hogen no Ran sequel. Another round of the same conflict between factions that had been contesting control of the court, this time with Minamoto no Yoshitomo, who had fought for Go-Shirakawa in the Hogen no Ran, now fighting against him. The crisis caught Go-Shirakawa in a vulnerable position. He was taken captive by Yoshitomo's forces, held in the palace, his freedom and his life depending on how the military conflict around him was resolved. It was resolved by Kiyomori, who returned to Kyoto and defeated Yoshitomo's forces. Go-Shirakawa was freed. Yoshitomo was killed. And Go-Shirakawa now owed his survival for the second time to the military capability of Tyranno Kiyomori. The debt was real, and Go-Shirakawa understood debts. The relationship between Go-Shirakawa and Kiyomori is one of the central relationships of the entire Heike Monogatari period, a relationship that lasted for more than 20 years, that went through phases of alliance and tension and outright conflict, and that shaped the political landscape of Japan in ways that would outlast both men. Understanding this relationship requires understanding what each man actually wanted, and how those wants were compatible and how they were not. Kiyomori wanted power. Specifically, he wanted the kind of power that the Fujiwara had exercised for centuries, the power of a family that sat at the center of the imperial system and shaped everything that emanated from that center. He wanted to place his daughter in the imperial household, to have his grandchild on the throne, to make the Taira the family through whom imperial authority was expressed and managed. This is what this series has described from Kiyomori's own perspective. From Go-Shirakawa's perspective, Kiyomori's ambition was something to be managed, something that could be useful, something that, if handled correctly, could be allowed to pursue its own goals in ways that served Go-Shirakawa's goals as well. Go-Shirakawa wanted something different. He wanted freedom of maneuver. Not in the sense of freedom from all constraint, not in the sense of the kind of unchecked authority that required no negotiation with anyone. Go-Shirakawa was too intelligent, too experienced in the realities of power, to believe that this kind of freedom was available to him or to anyone. What he wanted was the specific freedom of not being entirely controlled, not being entirely subject to any single power's management, maintaining always the possibility of reaching beyond the current arrangement to some alternative that would give him more room. This is a specific kind of political intelligence, the intelligence of the person who is never entirely in anyone's pocket, who always has some alternative available, some relationship that provides leverage against the relationship that might otherwise become constraining. The relationship between Go-Shirakawa and Kiyomori, for most of the 1160s and into the 1170s, was a relationship that served both of their needs, however unequally. Kiyomori got the court's cooperation for his political program, the legitimacy that came from the retired emperor's formal acknowledgement of the arrangements Kiyomori was making. Go-Shirakawa got, if not freedom, then at least the specific freedom of being the person whose cooperation Kiyomori needed, whose formal acknowledgement gave the arrangements their legitimacy, whose position was therefore valuable in ways that provided some protection against the most extreme versions of what Kiyomori's dominance might otherwise have produced. But the equilibrium was always unstable, always dependent on both men continuing to find the arrangement more useful than the alternatives. Kiyomori's patience with Go-Shirakawa was patience with a necessary tool, not patience with an equal. When Go-Shirakawa pushed too far against Kiyomori's plans, when the retired emperor's maneuvering became something that Kiyomori experienced as active interference rather than manageable friction, Kiyomori's response was the response of a man who had ultimately more force available than anyone else. The Shishitani incident of 1177, the conspiracy that this series has described in the context of Shigemori's story, was one of these moments. The moment when Go-Shirakawa's maneuvering had produced something that Kiyomori experienced as a direct threat, and when Kiyomori's instinct was to respond with force. Shigemori stopped him. But 2 years later, with Shigemori dead, Kiyomori arrested Go-Shirakawa. The arrest of 1179 was the most direct expression of what Kiyomori was actually willing to do when the constraints on his behaviour were removed. Go-Shirakawa was stripped of his formal functions, placed under guard, his ability to exercise even the limited forms of political influence available to a retired emperor, curtailed in the most direct possible way. For most people in Go-Shirakawa's position, this would have been the end. For Go-Shirakawa, it was a setback. He survived it. He continued to observe, to learn, to build relationships where relationships could be built, to wait for the thing that he had learned, over decades of watching powerful men overreach, was almost always coming. The thing that was coming for Kiyomori was the rebellion. And for Go-Shirakawa, the rebellion was not a disaster. It was an opportunity. Before this series goes further into the political story, it wants to spend some time with the other side of Go-Shirakawa. The side that the political narrative tends to overshadow, but that was, for Go-Shirakawa himself, not a sideline but something central. The music. Imayo was not, in the Heian world's official aesthetic hierarchy, the highest form of musical expression. The official hierarchy placed the formal music of the court ceremonies, the music that had been transmitted from the continent over centuries and that had become the specific expression of what the court understood as musical refinement, at the top of its aesthetic order. Imayo was popular music, the music of the streets, the entertainers, the people who travelled from place to place, performing for whatever audiences they could find. Go-Shirakawa loved it. The accounts of Go-Shirakawa's engagement with Imayo describe a man who did not simply appreciate this music as a pleasant diversion, but who pursued it with the intensity that this series has identified as one of his defining characteristics. He practiced. Not casually, not in the way that a man of his position might practice an instrument as part of a well-rounded courtly education, but seriously, to the point where the practice itself damaged his voice on multiple occasions, where the sustained effort of singing produced the specific physical consequences of sustained, intensive vocal training. He sought out the best performers of the tradition, people whose social position was far below his own, travelling to find them, spending time with them, learning from them in a way that required Go-Shirakawa to set aside the specific protocols that normally governed the relationship between someone of his status and someone of theirs. This willingness to cross social boundaries in pursuit of what he wanted to learn is one of the things that distinguishes Go-Shirakawa from most figures of comparable position in this period. The Heian court was organised around an extraordinarily refined system of social hierarchy, a system in which the distance between different levels of the hierarchy was maintained through the specific forms of interaction, the ways of speaking and moving and relating to each other, that marked each level of the social world as distinct from the others. Go-Shirakawa navigated this system when he needed to. He also, when something he genuinely wanted required crossing it, crossed it. The Imayo performers he sought out were not the people that a retired emperor was expected to spend time with. He spent time with them anyway. There is a specific connection between Go-Shirakawa's relationship with Imayo and his political intelligence, and it is worth exploring. The Imayo world was not the court world. The performers who carried this tradition were people who had developed, out of necessity, a specific kind of social intelligence. The intelligence of people who moved through different social environments, who read audiences, who understood what different people in different circumstances wanted and how to provide it. Go-Shirakawa, spending time in this world, absorbing not just the music, but the specific social intelligence of the people who made it, was developing, in this domain as well as in the political domain, the specific capacity for reading people and situations that would eventually make him one of the most effective political survivors of his era. He also compiled the Imayo. The Ryojin Hisho, the collection of Imayo songs that Go-Shirakawa compiled, is one of the most significant documents of the 12th century, not because of its political significance, but because of what it preserved. The specific songs, the specific forms of popular musical expression that would otherwise have been lost, carried only in the memories of the performers who sang them. Go-Shirakawa understood that these songs were worth preserving. He understood this not as an abstract cultural judgment, but as the understanding of someone who had been deeply inside this tradition, who knew from direct experience what it contained and why it mattered. The compiler of the Ryojin Hisho is not the image that most people carry of Go-Shirakawa, the image that tends to be formed from the political story. But it is part of who he was, part of what he spent his life on, part of what he left behind. He was not only the survivor, he was also the dancer, the one who loved the music enough to damage his voice learning it, and careful enough to write it down before it could disappear. The arrest of 1179 requires more attention than this series has yet given it, because it represents the lowest point of Go-Shirakawa's political career. The moment when everything that Kiyomori's dominance meant for Go-Shirakawa's freedom of maneuver was expressed in the most direct possible form. Kiyomori arrested the retired emperor. This had not been done before, in quite this way, in Japanese history. The retired emperor institution had survived for centuries precisely because it occupied a specific kind of position in the political landscape, a position that was understood, by everyone involved, as beyond the reach of direct force. Kiyomori reached anyway. What the arrest meant, in practical terms, was that Go-Shirakawa's ability to exercise even the limited forms of political influence that the retired emperor's position allowed was removed. He could not receive visitors in the way that generated the networks of obligation and relationship that were the currency of court politics. He could not issue the instructions and the appointments that represented the formal exercise of retired imperial authority. He could not, in the most immediate sense, maneuver. This was what Kiyomori wanted. A Go-Shirakawa who could not maneuver was a Go-Shirakawa who was not a problem. The arrest lasted until Kiyomori's death in 1181. 2 years. 2 years during which Go-Shirakawa was, in the formal sense, a prisoner. His freedom restricted, his political activities curtailed, subject to the specific form of control that Kiyomori had finally imposed after years of managing the more indirect forms of constraint that had characterized the earlier phases of their relationship. What did Go-Shirakawa do during these 2 years? The records do not give us a detailed account of his daily existence during this period. What they give us is the evidence of what he did immediately after the period ended, when Kiyomori died, and Go-Shirakawa was, once again, free to act. He acted immediately. The speed with which Go-Shirakawa resumed political activity after Kiyomori's death, the quickness with which he moved to re-establish his connections and to begin positioning himself within the new landscape that Kiyomori's death had created, suggests that the 2 years of imprisonment had not been 2 years of passivity. They had been 2 years of observation, of continued attention to everything that was happening in the world beyond the immediate constraints of his situation, of continued cultivation of whatever relationships could be cultivated, even within the specific limits that the arrest had imposed. Go-Shirakawa, confined, had continued to be Go-Shirakawa. He had watched. He had waited. He had paid attention. The political landscape that greeted Go-Shirakawa upon his effective release, with Kiyomori's death in 1181, was a landscape that had changed significantly from the landscape of 1179. The rebellion that Yoritomo had started in 1180, while Go-Shirakawa was still under arrest, had grown from a regional disturbance into something that was beginning to look like a genuine challenge to Taira dominance. The military situation was unclear. The Taira still had significant resources, but the trajectory was not what it had been before the rebellion started. Go-Shirakawa, released from the specific constraint of Kiyomori's direct control, looked at this landscape with the eyes of a man who had spent 2 years watching and waiting and thinking about what to do when he could act again. What he saw was an opportunity. Not a safe opportunity. Not a simple opportunity. But an opportunity of the kind that Go-Shirakawa had always been most at home with. The kind that existed in the gap between competing forces. In the space where someone who could move between different relationships without being entirely committed to any of them could find room to operate. He moved. The Shishitani incident of 1177 has appeared in this series before, in the context of Shigemori's story, as the moment when Shigemori's intervention prevented Kiyomori from arresting Go-Shirakawa. The moment that demonstrated both Shigemori's specific moral authority over his father and the specific limits of that authority. From Go-Shirakawa's perspective, the Shishitani incident was something else. It was the moment when a conspiracy that had been organised, at least in part, with Go-Shirakawa's awareness, was discovered and crushed. The conspiracy of Shishitani was, in its broad outlines, an attempt by a group of men connected to Go-Shirakawa's court to organise some form of action against the Taira's dominance. The specific nature of that intended action, whether it amounted to a plan for outright rebellion or something more limited, a political manoeuvre designed to reduce Taira influence rather than eliminate it entirely, is something the historical record does not fully clarify. What the historical record does clarify is that the conspiracy was discovered, that its participants faced severe consequences, and that Go-Shirakawa himself, while not the conspiracy's central figure, was connected to the people who were. Kiyomori's response to discovering the conspiracy was the response this series has described from Shigemori's perspective: the immediate desire to arrest Go-Shirakawa, to resolve once and for all the specific problem that Go-Shirakawa represented, by removing his ability to cause problems. Shigemori's intervention prevented this. From Go-Shirakawa's perspective, Shigemori's intervention was an act of protection, but not of the kind that came from personal affection or political alliance. Shigemori protected Go-Shirakawa because Shigemori believed that arresting the retired emperor was wrong, that it violated obligations that transcended even the family obligation to support his father's decisions. Go-Shirakawa was protected, in other words, not because he was liked or trusted, but because the person who had the specific moral authority to stop Kiyomori believed that the arrest was wrong. This is an important distinction because it tells us something about the specific quality of Go-Shirakawa's position throughout this period. He was not protected because he was powerful. He was not protected because of the loyalty of people who had chosen his side. He was protected, in this specific instance, by the ethical judgment of a man who might have had good reasons to dislike him, but who could not bring himself to support an action that violated his own principles. Go-Shirakawa understood this. He understood that his survival at this moment had depended not on anything he had done, but on the character of someone else. Someone who was not his ally in any simple sense, but who had, nonetheless, acted in a way that served Go-Shirakawa's survival. The lesson that Go-Shirakawa drew from the Shishitani incident was not, presumably, the lesson that he should stop trying to maneuver against Kiyomori's dominance. Go-Shirakawa was not the kind of person who stopped trying things because a specific attempt had failed. The lesson, rather, was a lesson about the specific landscape of the relationships around him. A lesson about who had what kind of influence over whom, about where the actual pressure points were in the system that constrained his freedom. Shigemori had influence over Kiyomori. This was information. Information that Go-Shirakawa filed away, as he filed away everything, for the future use that might make it relevant. 2 years later, Shigemori died. And 2 years after that, Kiyomori arrested Go-Shirakawa anyway. The lesson from Shishitani had a corollary. Shigemori's influence over Kiyomori was real, but it was also mortal. When Shigemori died, the constraint he represented died with him. Go-Shirakawa, in the arrest of 1179, learned what the political landscape looked like without Shigemori in it. The years between Kiyomori's death in 1181 and Dan-no-ura in 1185 were the years in which Go-Shirakawa demonstrated most fully the specific quality of political intelligence that this series has been describing. The ability to survive in a landscape where the most powerful forces were contending with each other without being destroyed by any of them. The landscape of 1181 was a landscape with multiple competing forces, none of them fully in control. The Taira, released from Kiyomori's specific direction after his death, was still a significant military force, but were increasingly struggling to maintain the initiative against Yoritomo's growing power in the east. Yoritomo was consolidating his position in the east, but had not yet achieved the kind of decisive military victory that would settle the question of who would ultimately prevail. And there was Yoshinaka. Minamoto no Yoshinaka is one of the more vivid figures of this entire period, a warrior from the mountains of Shinano province whose forces had achieved what the Taira had not prevented: the defeat of the largest Taira army ever assembled at Kurikara Toge in 1183, and who arrived in Kyoto later that year as the military force that had driven the Taira from the capital. Yoshinaka was capable. Yoshinaka was also, by the accounts of the period, difficult. Someone whose relationship to the court world and its specific forms of interaction was not characterized by the kind of patient sophistication that long engagement with court politics tends to produce. He was a warrior from the mountains. The capital was new to him, and his management of the capital was not, by most accounts, the management of someone who understood what the capital was or what it required. Go-Shirakawa's relationship with Yoshinaka was a relationship that this series wants to describe carefully, because it reveals something specific about how Go-Shirakawa operated with each new force that came into the picture. Yoshinaka, entering Kyoto as the military force that had driven out the Taira, needed something that only Go-Shirakawa could provide. He needed the formal acknowledgement of the court, the imperial legitimacy that gave his presence in the capital something more than simply the presence of an armed force that had taken the city. Go-Shirakawa provided this acknowledgement because providing it served Go-Shirakawa's interests, giving him a relationship with the new military force in the capital that could be used in whatever ways the situation allowed. But Yoshinaka's tenure in Kyoto was troubled from the beginning. His warriors in the capital produced the specific kinds of problems that warriors from outside a city produce when they occupy it: the friction between military behaviour and the expectations of a civilian population, the specific resentments that come from an army living off the resources of a city it has taken. Yoshinaka's political management of the situation was not adequate to these problems, and Go-Shirakawa, watching Yoshinaka struggle, was also watching Yoritomo in the east, watching Yoshitsune's forces moving toward Kyoto, toward the confrontation that would end Yoshinaka's time in the capital. Yoshinaka was not going to last. Go-Shirakawa understood this before Yoshinaka did. The specific pattern that Go-Shirakawa's political behaviour followed across the entire Genpei War period is the pattern of a man who is always watching the next force coming, always positioning himself so that when the current dominant force loses its dominance, he has already begun building the relationship with what comes next. With Kiyomori, he had been building, carefully and covertly, the relationships with Yoritomo that would give him an alternative when Kiyomori's dominance ended. With Yoshinaka, he was watching Yoshitsune, watching Yoritomo, watching the forces moving toward the inevitable confrontation. He was never entirely surprised. He was never entirely without an alternative. He was never entirely in anyone's pocket, even when he appeared to be. This is the specific quality that distinguished Go-Shirakawa from the other figures in this landscape. They were inside the war, fighting to determine its outcome. He was beside the war, watching it, maneuvering within it, surviving it. Yoshinaka's end came in the first month of 1184, at Owazu, the battle that this series has described in the context of Tomoe Gozen's story, the battle where Yoshinaka died and Tomoe Gozen rode away. Go-Shirakawa did not fight at Owazu. Go-Shirakawa never fought anywhere. Fighting was not his instrument. His instrument was the conversation, the message sent through an intermediary, the formal appointment that acknowledged someone's legitimacy, the carefully worded document that committed just enough to be useful without committing more than the situation required. By the time Yoshinaka died at Owazu, Go-Shirakawa was already in communication with Yoritomo. The relationship between Go-Shirakawa and Minamoto no Yoritomo is one of the most interesting political relationships of the entire period, because it was a relationship between two people who were each, in their own way, among the most politically sophisticated figures of their era. Yoritomo, who had spent 20 years in exile in Idzu, watching, learning, building the web of relationships and obligations that would eventually give him the foundation for his rebellion, was not a man who could be managed in the way that Yoshinaka could be managed. He understood what Go-Shirakawa was doing. He understood the specific form of political intelligence that Go-Shirakawa deployed, the careful positioning, the maintained alternatives, the formal acknowledgements that gave the relationship legitimacy without giving anyone more than they needed. Yoritomo deployed the same kind of intelligence. The negotiation between Go-Shirakawa and Yoritomo, conducted through intermediaries and through the formal channels of court appointments and imperial decrees, was a negotiation between two masters of the same art, each trying to extract what they needed from the relationship while giving as little as possible. Go-Shirakawa wanted Yoritomo's military support against the Taira, without having to commit to the kind of formal acknowledgement of Yoritomo's position that would give Yoritomo more leverage than Go-Shirakawa wanted him to have. Yoritomo wanted the imperial legitimacy that Go-Shirakawa's cooperation could provide, the formal acknowledgement of his position as the appropriate recipient of imperial authority to suppress the rebellion, without having to defer to Go-Shirakawa in ways that would undermine the independence of the warrior government he was building. Both men got something of what they wanted. Neither got everything. The specific form that this negotiation took, across the years of the Genpei War's final phases, was the form of a series of formal appointments and acknowledgements, each one carefully calibrated to give Yoritomo the legitimacy he needed for specific military and political purposes, while stopping short of the kind of comprehensive acknowledgement that would have given Yoritomo's position a quality that Go-Shirakawa did not want it to have. This calibration is one of the more impressive feats of political management in the entire period, not because of its long-term success. Yoritomo eventually got much of what he wanted, but because of the specific skill it required, the ability to give exactly as much as the situation required and no more, to maintain meaningful alternatives within a situation where the actual military balance was moving steadily in Yoritomo's favour. Go-Shirakawa also had, during this period, his own relationship with Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's most brilliantly capable military commander. This relationship would eventually become significant in ways that complicated Go-Shirakawa's management of his relationship with Yoritomo. Because Yoshitsune's specific qualities, the brilliant, unconventional military mind, the loyalty to the imperial cause, the willingness to act in ways that Yoritomo had not authorized, made Yoshitsune both useful and dangerous from multiple perspectives. Go-Shirakawa appreciated Yoshitsune. This appreciation was real, in the sense that Go-Shirakawa genuinely responded to Yoshitsune's qualities. It was also, potentially, useful, in the sense that a relationship with Yoshitsune could serve as an alternative to, or a check on, Yoritomo's growing dominance. Go-Shirakawa was always looking for alternatives. Yoshitsune was one of them. Dan-no-ura, in the third month of 1185, ended the Genpei War. The Taira were destroyed. The Emperor Antoku died in the sea. Kenrei-moen was pulled from the water. Tomomori chose the anchors. Nidono carried the emperor into the sea. Go-Shirakawa was in Kyoto. This is the specific fact that this series wants to hold for a moment, because it captures something essential about Go-Shirakawa's position throughout the entire period this series has been describing. Every other figure whose story this channel has told was at Dan-no-ura, or was directly affected by Dan-no-ura, or had made their choice and found their ending before Dan-no-ura arrived. Go-Shirakawa was in Kyoto, watching, waiting, already beginning to think about what came next. The news of Dan-no-ura arrived in Kyoto in the days after the battle. The emperor was dead. The sacred sword was lost. The Taira as a military and political force no longer existed. For most people in Kyoto, this news was received with the complicated mixture of relief and grief and uncertainty that the end of a 5-year war typically produces. For Go-Shirakawa, the news was also, and perhaps primarily, a signal. The specific configuration of forces that had defined the political landscape for the past 5 years had just changed, fundamentally, irreversibly. The Taira, who had been the dominant force for 2 decades before the war, and who had continued to represent one of the major poles of the conflict throughout the war, were gone. What remained was Yoritomo. And the question of what Go-Shirakawa's relationship with Yoritomo would look like now, with the Taira gone and the war over, and the specific justification for Yoritomo's military activity, the suppression of the Taira rebellion, having been achieved, was the question that was now defining the political landscape. Go-Shirakawa moved quickly. The appointments and the acknowledgements that followed Dan-no-ura, the formal recognition of what Yoritomo had achieved, and the specific forms in which that recognition was expressed, were managed by Go-Shirakawa with the same careful calibration that had characterized his management of the relationship throughout the war. He gave Yoritomo what the situation required. He tried to retain what the situation allowed him to retain. The tension between these two goals, the need to acknowledge Yoritomo's position and the desire to maintain enough independence to continue maneuvering, was the central tension of Go-Shirakawa's political situation in the years after Dan-no-ura. The Yoshitsune problem became the central expression of this tension. Yoshitsune, after Dan-no-ura, was the man who had won the war, the military genius whose campaigns at Ichinotani and Yashima and Dan-no-ura had been decisive. Yoritomo, who understood Yoshitsune's qualities and also understood the specific dangers that those qualities represented for Yoritomo's own political position, moved against Yoshitsune, denying him the formal acknowledgement of his achievements that Yoshitsune had expected. Go-Shirakawa, who had his own appreciation of Yoshitsune and his own reasons for wanting to maintain a relationship with him, found himself in the middle of this conflict between the two brothers, with both his relationship with Yoritomo and his relationship with Yoshitsune pulling him in different directions. What Go-Shirakawa did in this situation was, characteristically, try to maintain both relationships without fully committing to either. He gave Yoshitsune formal appointments that acknowledged his services, actions that Yoritomo interpreted as a challenge to his authority over his own commanders. He managed Yoritomo's response to these actions, the negotiations that followed, with the same careful calibration he had always deployed. The outcome was not entirely satisfactory for anyone. Yoshitsune eventually found himself a fugitive, pursued by Yoritomo's forces, eventually cornered in the north. Go-Shirakawa survived. He always survived. That was the thing about Go-Shirakawa. Whatever happened, whoever lost, Go-Shirakawa found a way to still be there when the next situation began. The years after Dan-no-ura and the Yoshitsune problem were the years in which the fundamental question of what the political landscape of Japan was going to look like, now that the Genpei War was over, was being worked out. The question was, in its most basic form, a question about the relationship between the court and the warrior government that Yoritomo was building in Kamakura. Would the court remain the formal centre of Japanese political authority, with Yoritomo's warrior government serving formally as the military instrument of court authority? Or would the warrior government become, in practice, if not in formal theory, the actual centre of power, with the court's formal authority remaining as a kind of legitimising framework for decisions that were actually made in Kamakura? Go-Shirakawa's preference was, obviously, the first arrangement, the arrangement that preserved more room for the court, and specifically for Go-Shirakawa himself, to manoeuvre. Yoritomo's preference was, equally obviously, the second arrangement, the arrangement that gave Kamakura the actual authority while using the court's formal framework for legitimacy. Both men understood that neither of them was going to get exactly what they wanted. The negotiation between these two preferences, conducted across the years after Dan-no-ura, was the central political negotiation of this period. Go-Shirakawa was not without resources in this negotiation. The court's formal authority was still the only source of legitimacy that Yoritomo's government could draw on. The specific appointments and acknowledgements that gave Yoritomo's warrior government its formal standing, the recognition that the arrangements Yoritomo was making were authorized by the imperial institution rather than simply imposed by military force, could only come from the court. And the court, in practice, meant Go-Shirakawa. This gave Go-Shirakawa something to trade with. Not as much as he would have liked, but something. The specific arrangements that emerged from this negotiation were the arrangements that would define Japanese governance for the next century and more. Yoritomo's government in Kamakura would exercise the actual military and administrative authority over the warrior class and over the provinces. The court in Kyoto would retain the formal authority of the imperial institution, the ceremonies and the appointments, and the symbolic centre of Japanese civilization. Both would exist simultaneously in a relationship of tension and mutual dependence that neither fully controlled. Go-Shirakawa negotiated this arrangement from the court's side. It was not everything he had wanted. It was more than most people in his position would have been able to retain. The specific quality of Go-Shirakawa's achievement in the years after Dan-no-ura is difficult to evaluate, precisely because what he achieved was largely defined by what he prevented rather than by what he created. He prevented Yoritomo from simply abolishing the court's formal role. He prevented the specific form of warrior dominance that would have eliminated any space for court politics entirely. He maintained within the new arrangement something of the position that the retired emperor institution had always occupied, the position of the person whose formal acknowledgement gave things their legitimacy. Whether this was enough, whether it represented a genuine preservation of court authority, or simply a delay of the court's eventual irrelevance, is a question that the centuries of Japanese history after Go-Shirakawa's death would answer in ways that Go-Shirakawa himself did not live to see. He did what he could. He always did what he could. It was more than anyone expected from the prince, who was never supposed to be emperor. The Yoshitsune problem, which this series has touched on in the previous parts, deserves its own treatment, because it represents one of the most significant moments in the entire post-war period, and one of the moments that most clearly reveals the specific limits of Go-Shirakawa's political intelligence. Yoshitsune, after Dan-no-ura, was a hero. Not in the formal sense, not yet in the specific way that his legend would eventually develop, but in the immediate sense that the people who had watched the Genpei War unfold understood Yoshitsune as the man whose military genius had been most directly responsible for ending it. At Ichinotani, it was Yoshitsune's descent from the cliffs that had broken the Taira position. At Yashima, it was Yoshitsune's crossing in dangerous weather that had driven the Taira from their island base. At Dan-no-ura, it was Yoshitsune's command that had translated the tides turning and Taga Chikatoshi's defection into the destruction of the Taira fleet. Yoshitsune had won the war. And Yoritomo was not comfortable with the man who had won the war being anyone other than Yoritomo. The specific quality of Yoritomo's discomfort with Yoshitsune is not simply the jealousy of a man who wants to claim credit for another's achievements, though that element was present. It was a more fundamental discomfort, the discomfort of a man who had spent 20 years building a political structure organised around the principle that military capability in service of the imperial cause ultimately derived its authority from Yoritomo's sanction, from Yoriov's position as the head of the warrior government. Yoshitsune, by acting with the kind of independent initiative that his military genius made possible, had demonstrated that military capability of his scale could operate outside Yoritomo's control. This was not acceptable to Yoritomo. Not because of personal jealousy, though that was also real, but because a warrior government that could not control its most capable commanders was not a government at all. Go-Shirakawa's role in the Yoshitsune problem was the role of someone trying to use the conflict between the two brothers as a source of political leverage, without fully understanding the specific dynamics of what he was dealing with. He gave Yoshitsune formal appointments that acknowledged Yoshitsune's services and gave him formal standing, appointments that Yoritomo interpreted as challenges to his authority. He may have believed that a Yoshitsune who had court support could provide a counterweight to Yoritomo's growing dominance, an alternative that would give Go-Shirakawa more room to maneuver. If this was the calculation, it was wrong. Yoritomo was not going to allow a situation to develop in which his most capable military commander had independent court support and was therefore not fully subject to Yoritomo's authority. He moved against Yoshitsune. The specific sequence of events that led from Yoshitsune's position as the hero of Dan-no-ura to his death as a fugitive in the north in 1189 is a sequence this channel will explore in more detail in its own series. What matters for Go-Shirakawa's story is that Go-Shirakawa's attempt to use Yoshitsune as a counterweight to Yoritomo failed. Yoshitsune died. Yoritomo's dominance was confirmed. And Go-Shirakawa had, in this specific instance, miscalculated. The miscalculation was significant, because it was one of the rare instances in Go-Shirakawa's political career where his attempt to maintain alternatives actually accelerated the consolidation of the power he was trying to balance against. Yoritomo, having dealt with Yoshitsune, was in a stronger position relative to Go-Shirakawa than he had been before. The lesson of the Yoshitsune problem, from Yoritomo's perspective, was that Go-Shirakawa would use any available alternative to complicate Yoritomo's consolidation of power. The response to this lesson, from Yoritomo's perspective, was to ensure that the alternatives available to Go-Shirakawa became increasingly limited. Go-Shirakawa survived this too, but he survived with less room than he had before. The game he had been playing for 40 years was getting harder. The room was getting smaller. He was still there, but the margins were narrowing. Nihon Ichi no Dai Tengu, Japan's greatest great Tengu. This is what Yoritomo is said to have called Go-Shirakawa, in the specific register of exasperation and respect that the phrase captures. Tengu, in Japanese religious tradition, are mountain spirits of extraordinary power and trickery. beings who are neither gods nor demons, but something in between, who can appear in human form, who possess supernatural knowledge and capabilities, who are impossible to predict, and even more impossible to fully control. Calling Go-Shirakawa Japan's greatest great Tengu was not a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was that Go-Shirakawa was something that Yoritomo, for all his political and military capability, could not simply deal with in any straightforward way. He could not arrest him, or not without the specific political costs that arresting the retired emperor would impose. He could not simply ignore him because the formal acknowledgement that the court provided was still something Yoritomo's government needed. He could not fully control him because Go-Shirakawa's specific quality of always having some alternative, some relationship, some angle that could be worked, made full control elusive. He was a Tengu. Powerful, unpredictable, present everywhere without quite being fully present anywhere. The specific quality that the Tengu image captures about Go-Shirakawa is the quality of something that doesn't quite fit the normal categories. He was an emperor, or rather a retired emperor, which meant that his relationship to formal authority was complex, neither fully inside the formal structure of power, nor fully outside it. He was a political operator, but not in the way that the warrior class operated, through military force and the specific forms of loyalty that military force generated. He was a survivor, but not through the specific kind of survival that comes from hiding or from accommodation. He survived by remaining in the game, by never losing his interest in the game, by finding something to work with in every situation. The Tengu comparison also captures something about Go-Shirakawa's relationship to the religious traditions that were woven through heian political life. Tengu were associated with specific sacred mountains, with the intersection of the human world and the world of spirits, with a kind of power that operated through different channels than the formal channels of court politics or warrior loyalty. Go-Shirakawa's own religious life, his connection to the Kumano shrines, and his patronage of various religious institutions placed him in relationship to these traditions in ways that added a dimension to his public identity that was not simply political. He was someone who moved between worlds, who was comfortable in spaces that others found difficult to navigate, who drew on resources that others didn't have access to. The Yoritomo who called Go-Shirakawa Japan's greatest great Tengu was a Yoritomo who had been dealing with Go-Shirakawa for years, who had negotiated with him, who had watched him maneuver around obstacles that would have stopped most people, who had seen him survive things that should have ended his political career. The phrase is exasperated. But it is also, underneath the exasperation, something like admiration. You don't call someone Japan's greatest great Tengu unless you have come to understand that they are genuinely exceptional, that the specific quality they possess is real and significant, that the obstacles they have overcome are not trivial. Yoritomo understood this about Go-Shirakawa. Even as he was working to limit Go-Shirakawa's room to maneuver, he understood what he was dealing with. Japan's greatest great Tengu, the prince who was never supposed to be emperor, still there, still maneuvering, still impossible to finish off. By the late 1180s, Go-Shirakawa was an old man in the terms of this period's life expectancy, if not in terms of the absolute number of years he had lived. He was in his early 60s, which was not, in 12th century Japan, the young end of old age. But the specific quality of his oldness was different from the oldness of most people who had lived as long as he had lived in the specific circumstances he had lived in. He had not worn out. The people who had been his contemporaries, the people who had shared the political landscape with him across the decades of his active political life, were mostly dead. Kiyomori, the man who had imprisoned him and thought he had neutralized him, had died in 1181. Shigemori, the man who had saved him from Kiyomori's worst impulse, had died in 1179. Yoshinaka, who had occupied the capital and thought he could use Go-Shirakawa, had died at Owazu in 1184. Yoshitsune, the most brilliant military commander of the era, had died as a fugitive in 1189. The Taira themselves were gone, destroyed at Dan-no-ura, their clan eliminated as a military and political force in a single afternoon in 1185. Go-Shirakawa had outlasted all of them. What did this feel like? The records do not give us direct access to Go-Shirakawa's internal experience of having outlasted so many contemporaries. The chronicles of this period are not interested in the emotional texture of survivorship, in what it means to keep finding yourself on the other side of the deaths of people you have known and contended with and depended on and struggled against. But the question is worth asking, because Go-Shirakawa was not simply a political operator, not simply a calculating machine who moved pieces around the board without feeling. He was also a person who had practiced imayo until his voice gave out, who had compiled the songs of the tradition he loved, who had, in his own specific way, been fully engaged with the world he lived in, not just with its political dimensions. The world that Go-Shirakawa had lived in had changed almost beyond recognition between the year of his birth and the late 1180s. He had been born into the heian world at its late flowering, the world that would produce the specific aesthetic and cultural achievements that the term heian evokes. The poetry and the ceremonies and the refined cultivation of beauty that this series has described in many contexts. He had watched that world transform, across the decades of his active political life, into something fundamentally different. A world in which warrior power had become the actual basis of authority, in which the court's formal structures remained, but their substantive content had been evacuated, in which the specific civilization that had produced him was present as form without its former substance. He had watched all of this happen. He had been, in many ways, at the centre of it happening. And he was still there, in the late 1180s, in the capital, in the specific role he had always occupied, the retired emperor whose formal acknowledgement gave things their legitimacy, the Tengu who could not be finished off. Yoritomo was in Kamakura, consolidating the warrior government that would govern Japan for the next century and more. Go-Shirakawa was in Kyoto, managing what could still be managed, watching what still needed to be watched. The room was smaller than it had been. The alternatives were fewer. The specific landscape of forces that he had been navigating for 40 years had settled into a configuration that left him less freedom than the most fluid phases of the war had allowed. But he was there. He was 63 years old when Yoshitsune died. He had, as it turned out, 3 more years to live. 3 more years of watching and manoeuvring and surviving. Go-Shirakawa Ho-o died in the 3rd month of 1192 at the age of 66. The cause of his death is not described in the surviving records with the kind of specific detail that would permit a modern diagnosis. But the accounts suggest the kind of decline that comes with age and with the accumulated wear of a life lived at the intensity that Go-Shirakawa's life had been lived. He had been practicing imayo intensively enough to damage his voice. He had been navigating political crises since he was 28 years old. He had been imprisoned, released, manoeuvred around, threatened, exasperated, and celebrated. He had survived all of it. He died of age. The timing of his death has a specific significance that this series wants to note. Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate, formally in 1192, the same year that Go-Shirakawa died. This timing is not a coincidence in the most direct sense. Yoritomo was not waiting for Go-Shirakawa to die before taking this step. The political and institutional preparations for the shogunate had been underway for some time. But the timing is suggestive. The formal establishment of the warrior government as the shogunate, the specific institutional form that would define Japanese governance for centuries, occurred in the year that the man who had been the most significant representative of the court's political authority died. There is something in this timing that feels like a transition, a moment when one era gave way to another, when the specific configuration that Go-Shirakawa had navigated, the configuration in which the court and the warrior power were contending with each other, without either fully prevailing, gave way to the configuration that would define what came next. Yoritomo outlived Go-Shirakawa by 7 years, dying in 1199. Yoshitsune had died 3 years before Go-Shirakawa. Kiyomori had died 11 years before. Go-Shirakawa, the man who was never supposed to be emperor, outlasted the man who had imprisoned him, the man who had saved him, the man who had tried to use him from the north. The entire Taira clan that had dominated Japan for a generation, and the most brilliant military commander of his era. He did not outlast Yoritomo, but he came closer than anyone expected. The accounts of Go-Shirakawa's final period, the months before his death, describe a man who continued to be engaged with the things that had engaged him throughout his life: the religious practices, the music, the management of whatever could still be managed within the specific constraints that the late 1180s and early 1190s had imposed. He did not give up. He was not a person who gave up. He had spent his entire political life finding ways to continue when continuing seemed impossible, finding alternatives when the obvious paths were blocked, finding the specific space in every situation that allowed him to remain relevant. He continued this until he could not. Go-Shirakawa died in 1192. He was 66 years old. He had been at the centre of Japanese politics for nearly 40 years. He had been emperor, and then retired emperor, and then prisoner, and then free, and then manoeuvring in the space between the Taira and the Minamoto as they destroyed each other, and then negotiating with Yoritomo in the aftermath of that destruction. He had been Japan's greatest great Tengu. He had not outlasted everyone. Yoritomo was still there. The warrior government was solidifying into the shogunate. The court's actual authority was diminishing in ways that would continue long after Go-Shirakawa was gone. But he had outlasted more than anyone expected. He had done more than anyone expected, with the position that no one had expected him to hold. He died the most powerful man in Japan. Not the most powerful in the sense of the man with the most military force. Yoritomo had that. The most powerful in the sense of the man who had managed to remain relevant, to remain maneuverable, to remain someone whose cooperation was still needed, and whose opposition was still something to be managed. Through everything that 40 years of the most turbulent political period in Japanese history had produced. He died, still in the game. He was never supposed to be emperor. He died the most powerful man in Japan. This series has now told the stories of 12 figures from the world of the Heike monogatari. 12 angles on the same set of events, the same decades, the same catastrophic collision between the heian world's long decline and the warrior power that eventually replaced it. Ken Rei Mo In, who went into the sea and was given back. Kumagai Naozane, who killed the boy and spent his life praying for him. Tomoe Gozen, who rode to the end and would not leave until ordered to. Shigehara, who burned the Buddha and carried that burning to the Kizugawa. Tomomori, who saw everything and chose the anchors. Koremori, who left his family and walked toward Nachi. Mune Mori, who could not choose. Atsumori, who carried the flute inside his helmet. Shigemori, who tried to stop his father and ran out of time. Kiyomori, who spared the 9-year-old boy who destroyed everything he built. Nidono, whose last act was to hold the emperor. And Go-Shirakawa, who outlasted nearly all of them. Go-Shirakawa's place in this series is different from the place of any of the other figures, because his relationship to the events this series has explored was not the relationship of someone inside them, shaped by them in the way that the figures who were inside them were shaped. He was beside them. He was watching. He was maneuvering. He was surviving. This does not mean he was untouched by what happened. The specific events this series has described, the battles and the retreats and the deaths and the final catastrophe at Dan-no-ura, were events that Go-Shirakawa witnessed from the specific position he had always occupied. The position of someone who was central to the political landscape, but not directly inside the military and human catastrophe that unfolded within it. There is a question that Go-Shirakawa's story invites, a question that this series wants to sit with rather than resolve. What does it mean to survive the way Go-Shirakawa survived? To outlast the people who imprisoned you, the people who used you, the people who tried to control you. To remain in the game when everyone else has been forced out of it. To be, at the end, still there, still maneuvering, still relevant. Is this an achievement? It is certainly a form of success, measured by the specific metric of remaining relevant in a landscape that destroyed so many others. Is it admirable? That is a different question, and a more complicated one. The figures this series has explored were not, for the most part, survivors in the way Go-Shirakawa was a survivor. They were inside things. They made choices that cost them. They loved people and lost them. They believed in things, even when those things were doomed. Kiyomori believed in what he was building. Shikimori believed in the obligations that his birth had given him. Nidono believed that carrying the emperor into the sea was the right thing to do. Atsumori believed, or acted as if he believed, that turning back when challenged was what a person of his formation did. Go-Shirakawa believed in survival, and he was very, very good at it. But Go-Shirakawa was not only the survivor. This series has tried to remember throughout that he was also the dancer, the person who practiced imayo until his voice gave out, who compiled the songs of a tradition he genuinely loved, who was, in his engagement with the things that genuinely engaged him, fully present in a way that the purely calculating politician could not have been. He was both, the survivor and the dancer, the man who always had an angle and the man who sang until his voice broke, the politician who cooled himself into every situation, and the person who loved music enough to damage himself learning it. He was never supposed to be emperor. This is where this story began, and this is where it ends, with the fact of the gap between what was expected of him and what he became. The fourth son, the one not being prepared, the one with the freedom that comes from not being watched. He used that freedom to become something that the careful preparations for the expected heirs did not produce. He became the Tengu, the one you couldn't finish off, the one who was still there when everyone else was gone. He was never supposed to be emperor. He died the most powerful man in Japan. And in the specific gap between those two facts, in the 40 years of watching and maneuvering and surviving and dancing that filled that gap, is the story of the Heian world's end, as seen from the one pair of eyes that watched all of it, from beginning to end, without ever quite being inside it. He saw everything. He outlasted almost everyone. He was never supposed to be there. He was there anyway.